Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition, week 12 or so I'm led to believe here in early November. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, I purposefully did not ask you about what we saw transpire in South Florida on Saturday night when we did the NFL podcast on Monday, but how happy were you with Mike Norvell going out there and putting his stamp on the rebuild taking place in Tallahassee at the expense of the Miami Hurricanes?
Gotta love it, but we all watched it unfold and nothing really needs to be said other than the scoreboard really wasn't indicative of what transpired there. I was looking at our advanced box score, and it was actually a 52-point win by the Florida State Seminoles. And so, listen, Miami's heading in the wrong direction this season, right? And I don't think anybody's, even the numbers guys, right, aren't quite sure what's going on there. And I kind of want to watch my words because this isn't anything new to anybody that's listened to this podcast about our thoughts on Mario Cristobal. We outlined them when he was back at FIU, outlined them when he was at Oregon, and there is no doubt the man can recruit, and he is in the absolute hotbed for talent. And we're in the new NIL era, so I'm not throwing shade here, but you understand what's being done. When you go out and get trounced by Duke, and 48 hours later, you're flipping a 6-week silent commit in Cormani McClain to Miami, you understand what's transpiring, okay? And so ultimately, that's the only way Miami's going to get out of this. And the price just went up. If you are a recruit and you see what's transpiring, I need to see double, Mr. Ruiz. And let's see if they're able to hold on to some of the guys they currently have in the class with added financial benefits. But I think the one thing that you're noticing here, and it was shocked me, and partly why we crapped on the Josh Gaddis hire. If you're Miami, what are you doing hiring the guys you hired on this staff? All we heard about is he hired a staff of great recruiters. Well, if the duffel bag is endless, what you really want is guys who can coach. You don't need them to be great recruiters.
It's a very good point.
We'll see if there is a fundamental shift in actually getting savvy coaches because the recruiting is going to be handled by the billionaire John Ruiz.
How worried should you be if you're a Texas A&M fan about what's going on there? You talk about the size of duffel bags and everything else. I mean, that's a program on the cusp of missing a bowl game as well, where the losses are starting to mount. We saw one high-profile player decommit. Is he the first of the dominoes we're going to see that were originally destined to end up in College Station that may take their talents elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be multiple, and you're starting to see it from prior classes too. I mean, he suspended a handful of guys, and they're typically the same guys, right? The Denver Harrises of the world. And yeah, I think there'll be some exodus, not just from Jimbo's last class, but a few of the previous ones as well. And I mean, right now, this is worse than someone. And so you just wonder, I understand the fiscal responsibility that this involves buying him out. But I think the first option is forcing an offensive hire down his throat, and that's what we might see transpire. But God forbid you close the season with a couple more losses, someone might just be like, F it here, and let's start this thing over. So we will see what unfolds there. It's just a really interesting college football landscape right now, and didn't really mean to get into the nitty-gritty of NIL and recruiting and
It is the time of year. Trust me, there are a lot of fan bases who aren't seeing themselves immersed in the discussion for the college football playoff, which is the other thing I want to get to before we bring Brad in. We saw another unveiling. Georgia showed us last weekend that they are the true number one team. They're obviously going to control their destiny. We'll see how things unfold in the Big Ten. A lot to be sorted out there between Michigan and Ohio State. Tennessee, despite being on the outside looking in, I still think very much in the thick of things. If they go 11-1, get some help around them. But a fascinating landscape that's starting to transpire. In TCU, I think their fans are thrilled that they're number 4. It's a game that we're going to break down, and we'll get Brad's thoughts on as well. But again, I don't like to talk about this, and I know you picked on me before, and I'm starting to see the light. It's more a reality show than anything else. I mean, we have multiple data points that are going to end up making this decision much easier for the committee. I just don't want to see 3 SEC teams in the college football playoff.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I don't see that unfolding that way. And yes, there is some work to be done here, but we're going to talk about the game, so I don't want to soil it. But, TCU got their wish. They're number 4. I don't ultimately think that that's going to be a team included in the 4 based upon the game this upcoming weekend. I think the real debate here is Tennessee or Oregon, and I wanted to pose that question when Brad was on, but I think we can kind of tip it off a little bit here because that was all the rave yesterday on social media, even leading up to the unveiling. But if Tennessee runs the table and Oregon runs the table, I think you have some serious question marks to the Vols getting in because Oregon has the far better schedule down the stretch. They would potentially be, or they would have to be, right, the conference champion. And then I think when you just kind of take a step back and look at it logically, are we really going to judge the losses of Tennessee in Oregon differently against Georgia? And my answer to that would be you should, because I understand the scoreboard showed some discrepancy, but within our advanced box score, both Tennessee and Oregon were 26-point losers to Georgia. And the difference would be this was Josh Heupel's, 23rd game in Tennessee, and it wasn't his first game like it was for Dan Lanning. I mean, joy. First game of the new regime. Let's go play Georgia. Yeah, let's travel multiple time zones to do it.
Your old employer in their backyard in Atlanta.
So I think that one's going to be interesting to watch unfold. I don't really want to cause mass hysteria in the mentions of Tennessee and Oregon fans, but that's just how I would see that unfold based upon the remaining schedule and based upon the situation that transpired when both teams played Georgia.
And look, honestly, a Tennessee fan that may get fired up over this, it's not a knock on Tennessee. It's more a direct reflection of the way that Oregon is trending and how good Georgia is. So I don't think Vols fans, Ducks fans have anything to be discouraged about. And the silver lining for Tennessee, if you're trying to go apples to apples, your schedule the next 3 games significantly easier than what Oregon will have to deal with beginning as early as this week against Washington.
Might not even be a question.
Yeah,
right?
They'll play Utah in 2 weeks. Exactly right. So all fun and games until we actually see the games take place on the football field. But we've done enough dilly-dallying. Let's get into the nuts and bolts and the marquee matchups of the week. He joins us every Wednesday here on the Bet the Board podcast. You, of course, can follow Brad Powers on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. And Brad, we had our second unveiling last night of the college football playoff rankings. I know there was a fan base down there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that was extremely excited about TCU making the top 4, but I have the slightest inkling that you don't have TCU anywhere near being one of the top 4 teams in the country, despite what they've been able to accomplish this year in Sonny Dykes' first season.
Yeah, if they were a little unsettled with the playoff committee rankings last week, they would certainly be more than unsettled where I have TCU. I don't even have them in my top 10. In fact, I have TCU number 14 in my current power ratings. And, if you disagree with me, then run to the window and bet them this week because they're a touchdown underdog against a 3-loss Texas team. And to put in perspective, how much I think or don't think that highly of TCU, not only a 3-loss Texas team do I have ahead of them, but I would even have Florida State, Payne's beloved Seminoles, who are on fire. I would have them slightly better. than TCU on a neutral field.
It's pretty wild when you look at some of these teams, and I know TCU fans that are tuning in are going to go, holy hell, what the hell is wrong with these guys? Brad's now a Florida State homer as well. But that's not meant as a knock at TCU because, Brad, I have to imagine you've upgraded this team as much as any team inside the top 15, given what they've done amid this undefeated start.
Yeah, of all those teams in the top 14 that I have in my power rankings, I've upgraded TCU more than any team in that grouping. So, I mean, it's not like I've been slow to the party. I'm not fully buying in everything that's going on. I think a lot of it is, I don't want to use the word luck factor, but when you faced 4 different backup quarterbacks in the second half of games, mostly due to injury, I don't know if you can replicate that a lot moving forward. That's not something that I think transfers game after game after game.
And we will have a deep dive of the TCU-Texas game a little bit later in the show. Payne, you already did your victory lap about Florida State's domination of Miami at the top of the show, so we're not going to rehash that right now.
What's with you, by the way? Brad yelled at me last week in my breakdown for saying if, and it's because you're telling everyone I'm a homer, and then I was emotional about the breakdown, all of that garbage.
I didn't say...
We just view these teams straightforward.
We know how things go around here. I continue to bust your balls, you bust my balls back, and we infuriate a Miami fan base that may have buyer's remorse on Mario Cristobal. So, I mean, that's probably the best of both worlds on that particular front. Either way, gentlemen, we got games to get into, and we talk about teams that are unranked or perceived to be worse, quote unquote, laying points. I think it's the perfect segue into an ACC matchup this weekend under the lights in Winston-Salem, where Wake Forest will welcome in the North Carolina Tar Heels. You're looking at Wake Forest, a 3.5-point home favorite. Highest total on the board right now, sitting at 78 at some shops, 77.5 elsewhere. Wake last faced a ranked UNC team back in 1997. A win by North Carolina on Saturday night would give UNC 9 wins in a season for the first time since going 11-3 back in 2015 under Larry Fedora's leadership. Of course, the Tar Heels seeking their first conference championships since 1980, something that looks significantly more attainable as Clemson has shown to be vulnerable on the other half of the draw. And when you look at the most 2 recent meetings between these familiar foes, guys, defense has been optional. 225 points combined over their last 2 matchups. High total here, Brad, indicates that we're not going to see many stops this afternoon. Fair or foul with where odds makers have set this particular point spread?
I'm going to say a little bit foul on the total. I mean, I would get the total being, I mean, this is the highest total we've seen in college football this year, along with this week's UCLA-Arizona game. I would get the total if you're just, going off past series history. But this year, I mean, North Carolina leaves a lot to be desired defensively and then some. But they've been better than what they were certainly the first 2-3 weeks of the season. And, Wake Forest, to me, obviously, the last few weeks has struggled with turnovers. So I can tell you that I make a lot of bets on the openers. I did take a piece of under 78.5 on that. That was kind of I wasn't stunned that it was in the 70s. I was stunned that it was in the upper 70s, considering what we saw from at least these 2 teams recently.
Brad, you mentioned turnovers, and Payne, I obviously want to get your take on this because clearly Wake Forest is going to have to clean that up. When you look at their performances over the last 2 weeks, they go on the road, struggle against Louisville's defense. They struggled against NC State a bit last week. And Sam Hartman, for all of his accolades and what he's been able to do as a member of the Demon Deacons football program, still 0-2 in his career versus UNC, but Wake has averaged 54 points per game. And you look at his Pro Football Focus grade last week, even after throwing multiple interceptions, still came out quite favorably. Is this the perfect antidote matched up against the UNC defense that leaves a lot to be desired to get his receivers involved, to start to get the confidence back and remind us he's the same quarterback that was able to shred Clemson's defense what feels like an eternity ago?
Yeah, those are really good questions. And, the reason I think Brad dabbled a little bit under here is just market perception. I believe Brad's been watching Wake Forest intently the last 2 weeks because he's bet on those games. And, on the surface, you do have 2 top 20 offenses in schedule adjusted efficiency and 2 top 20 offenses in plays per minute and 2 defenses that are outside the top 80 in schedule adjusted defensive efficiency. And that's why this total opened the highest college football season. But I don't necessarily dislike that contrarian angle. I don't really think there's much you can glean from breaking down both sides of the ball in depth, because it'll dramatically slant towards both offenses. But I do think within those units, there's three areas that will ultimately determine this game. When I look at this and you have potentially a back and forth tennis-like match here, I think it's about a number of possessions. And the more possessions you have for your offense, the better. And turning over your opponent is going to be key here. And you guys both referenced Wake Forest having some turnover issues the last two games, 11 of them in total. But I think there's some positive regression on the way. Of the 11 turnovers, less than half were expected based upon the way the play unfolded. And typically, the cause of turnovers is the opposing defense making you uncomfortable, creating havoc. Well, North Carolina doesn't really do that. They're outside the top 120 in schedule-adjusted havoc created. Wake Forest defense is actually about 50 spots better in that metric. And part of the cause for the turnovers Wake Forest was expected to commit is that their slow mesh offense has really been one-dimensional the last 2 weeks, about 100 total rushing yards when removing garbage time those 2 weeks. And you look at Louisville and NC State defensively, they're actually pretty damn good, about 20th in average defensive efficiency between those two teams. And both Louisville and NC State like to incessantly run blitz this slow mesh. And I think maybe some teams are starting to figure that out a little bit, but I don't know if that's as much a concern here, because you do have a Wake offense that's stepping down in class, and I think we'll have a little bit more balance against North Carolina, who's outside the top 120 in rushing success rate allowed. The other area that I think is pretty impactful in a game like this is when you see the kicker trot out onto the field, that's a win for the defense. And, holding your opponent to field goals, I just think is a real win in a game like this. North Carolina's defense, 110th in the country in schedule-adjusted points allowed per opportunity. So when opposing offenses reach the Tar Heels green zone, they're bottom 20 in the country in allowing points. Wake Forest defensively is bordering around the top 50 in that same metric, so well above the national average. Wake's defense has shown the ability to play that bend but don't break style. But I think the biggest thing for me here is the price. I'm going to take a page out of Brad's playbook when we talk about that. If UNC played Wake Forest 2 weeks ago before the 11 turnovers transpired into back-to-back losses, we would have made Wake Forest an 8.5-point favorite in this game. UNC has not played a freaking soul. It's FAMU. It's App State, who's down a notch. It's Georgia State, Va-Tech, Miami, Duke, Pitt, Virginia. A lot of those ACC teams that we didn't think would be very good coming into the season are even worse than we expected. The best team UNC's played, it's Notre Dame at home as a 3-point favorite, and the Tar Heels trailed by 25 in the fourth quarter. You may see that flashy 8-1 record, but to me, Mac Jones was on the hot seat coming into the season, and the only reason he's removed himself from that is because he hit the quarterback lotto with Drake May, and the schedule has been absolute trash. And so this, to me, is a little bit of an interesting buy low spot on Wake.
You mentioned Drake May, and we've obviously seen his odds to win the Heisman come crashing down. Pretty reputable draft prognosticator in Dane Brugler said he would have been the number one quarterback to come off the board in 2023 if he was eligible for the draft. So there is no doubt NFL executives and such are taking notice of what he's been able to accomplish. The chemistry and rapport he's established with Josh Downs going to be difficult to try and contend with. But to your point, Payne, talking about North Carolina and how they benefited immensely from the schedule, I mean, Notre Dame bullied them at the point of contact. They did what they wanted when they needed to. And then I actually went back and I wanted to look at how they performed against Pitt. If Keaton Slovis makes a couple of throws early on in that game and Pitt's offense isn't completely inept, I mean, Pittsburgh probably runs away and hides in a game where we saw Pitt take very real professional money in Kenan Stadium from 3 down to 2.5. They just imploded in the fourth quarter. So a variety of things to look for. And I guess, Brad, we can finish on this note. When you look at North Carolina from where they are now versus where they were coming into the season, giving all the questions we have about strength of schedule, have you done much in terms of adjusting either up or down in some cases what the Tar Heels are now versus what they were before the year started?
It's a very good question. Despite the fact they're sitting here at 8-1, I have downgraded North Carolina about 1.5 points. They're not even in the top 40 of my power ratings. So I'm going to agree with Payne that it does seem like this is Wake Forest spot here. And my power ratings agree with that. I'm closer to that 5.5 range on the Demon Deacons. So I think a lot of people would be surprised that, that there's North Carolina number 15 in the College Football Playoff Committee rankings, not even in my top 40.
We always get a couple of those pretenders, and we'll see on Saturday if North Carolina is up for the test. Their schedule gets significantly more difficult as they also have a season finale game that could be for all the marbles against NC State as well. We'll stick in the ACC, guys, for Clemson and Louisville. The now one-loss Clemson Tigers find themselves as a full touchdown favorite at home in Death Valley against the Louisville Cardinals. This game will kick off 3:30 Eastern time. When you look at the head-to-head between these programs, Clemson leads all time 7-0. Last year's game, however, came down to the final possession. You saw Clemson get a defensive stop inside the 5-yard line. But before that, the previous 3 years, Clemson beat Louisville by a combined 122 points. Clemson 5-2 ATS all-time versus Louisville. But you look at the Cardinal, this is a group that looks significantly more buttoned up and poised to make a little bit of noise over their last 4 weeks. They've gone 4-0 ATS. They've held each of their last 4 opponents to 21 points or less. And what's been more impressive, Brad, is how well Louisville has adjusted in terms of their second half defense. They've given up just 17 points in those 4 games. It's taken some of the pressure off Malik Cunningham, who is a little bit dinged up, dealing with an injury on his non-throwing hand. But when you look at the Clemson Tigers, I know you were a little bullish on them last week against Notre Dame. What have you done to try and adjust their overall season outlook in the wake of that loss in South Bend?
Well, you don't want to overreact to just one game, but sometimes it might call for it. And last week, I wasn't stunned that Notre Dame was the right side, that Notre Dame covered, that Notre Dame won. I was just stunned in the fashion that it went down, and that was Clemson being absolutely dominated at the line of scrimmage on both sides, particularly Clemson's vaunted rush defense, that maybe there were signs, especially in the Florida State game, that maybe they weren't as good as what the stats said. But still, I mean, the expectation was, hey, Notre Dame can't throw the football, and Notre Dame didn't throw the football in the game. They passed for less than 100 yards. You would have hoped that Clemson would have been able to stack the box, and they did, and they still got run over by Notre Dame's rushing offense. So that was the type of performance, especially off a bye, and especially when the whole country was already questioning your ranking to begin with. I expected Clemson to go into South Bend, play with a chip on their shoulder, and we just did not see that. What I saw was a Clemson team that not only got run over on the defense side of the ball, but then continues to have major question marks at the most important position, quarterback. DJ gets pulled again. Klubnik comes in for 2 plays, one of them being a pick down at his own goal line. He doesn't come back. They put DJ back in. So I don't know what the frame of mind is, not only for both quarterbacks, but I don't know what the frame of mind is for the entire team. And I think it goes back to what Dabo did in the offseason, and that is, instead of going out there and hiring probably some attractive candidates because they were attractive positions at OC and DC, he hired from within. And when they finally had to step up and play a decent opponent instead of all these weak ACC teams, they got fully exposed. So I'm questioning the direction of not only this season for Clemson, but their program as a whole.
Well, there's always a chance they can go get Jeff Scott back and bring him into the coaching staff now that he's looking for a little bit of work, that the experiment in Tampa didn't go so well. And Brad, you mentioned the quarterback carousel. I mean, Dabo wasn't exactly airing a level of confidence in DJU for this week, saying that they have to come up with some defined packages for Cade. It almost indicated that there could be a little bit more of a timeshare. And when you look at the recent history for Clemson, they're not used to being in this spot. I mean, that snapped a 14-game winning streak for their program. They haven't lost consecutive games to unranked opponents since 2006 when Tommy Bowden was their head coach. And while you look at a 38 straight home game win streak, last loss coming on November 12th, 2016 versus Pitt, they're under 500 against the spread, which tells me obviously they've been a little bit overvalued. Payne, in comes a Louisville team. Scott Satterfield very much on the hot seat, but it's almost like the momentum of landing those 5-star recruits early in the year has carried this entire program to some of the momentum they're seeing. We knew Malik Cunningham could be electric in the way he leads an offense, but the defense has been a positive revelation. Brad mentioned Florida State's ability to run the football against Clemson's defensive front. They've now given up 200-plus rushing yards in 2 of their last 3 games. When you look at this matchup, do you think Louisville has an edge on the offensive or potentially on the defensive side matched up against the beaten-down Tiger side?
Well, the first thing is Louisville might be losing one of those recruits to Georgia, so we'll see how that ultimately unfolds. I do think Malik Cunningham against a struggling Clemson front seven is an interesting matchup, but we've talked about that part of Clemson's team for multiple weeks now, and Brad mentioned the struggles they had against Florida State, and even Syracuse was able to run the ball. They just didn't run it enough. I think the other side here is what matters most, with a Louisville defense going against a struggling Clemson offense and DJU, and you kind of just look at it, it's like two ships passing in the night. They're trending in completely opposite directions, to your point, the way Louisville's defense is played. And I think you could even make the case that, hey, Louisville's had a little glimpse of this Clemson offense a month ago, playing a variant of it against former Clemson OC Tony Elliott in Virginia. So that could help here just a little bit in terms of preparation. But I think there's three things that might allow Clemson to look a little bit more competent offensively than the last two games. I mean, it'd be tough being worse. But the first here is, Louisville does have some issues in the trenches on defense. The D-line is the weak point, and when you adjust for schedule, Louisville's outside the top 80 in EPA per rush allowed, and they've been horrific allowing first downs on early downs. So it's likely, whether it's Cade, whether it's DJ, they're going to be operating from a lot more standard downs where both the run and the pass are a little bit of a threat. And because Louisville's D-line isn't great, you're looking at their DC, Brian Brown. He's got to dial up all kinds of blitzes, run blitzes. And that's actually made some of their metrics slanted a little bit because they're blitzing so much, and they've been pretty successful on that. They're also blitzing on passing downs. You just name it. They're sending a lot of heat. Right now, Louisville's blitzed on more than 46% of opponent dropbacks. That number is approaching 50% over the last 4 games where they've gone on this win streak, so I would expect that to continue. But the one area where DJ's been solid is against the blitz. He grades out quarterback 20 among 151 qualifiers when defenses send heat. He's shown a willingness to attack the attacker. That's something we talk about all the time. If defenses are going to blitz you, you got to make them pay for it. DJ's ADOT 9.7 yards when blitzed. His big time throw rate is over 11%. The final thing here in my mind is this is a little bit of a step down in class for Clemson. Louisville's played one top 35 offense all season. Okay. Their other opponents combined to have an average schedule adjusted efficiency rank of 60th. Clemson, even after the last 2 weeks where they've kind of thrown up on themselves offensively, still a top 30 offense. And so I think there's some areas here to exploit for Louisville. That's still a pass defense that's outside the top 100 in schedule adjusted EPA per play as well. And you just start looking at some of the numbers here. Like, had this game been played last week, Clemson's laying 10 on a neutral, right? They're now laying 7 at home. And I know I was probably a touch higher on Clemson than Brad last week, so his numbers probably don't indicate that, but that's kind of where we sat here. So it'll be interesting to see where this line trends, because obviously we're on the key of 7. Haven't seen much action in regards to the side. Limits will be increasing here over the next 48 hours. So let's see which way on this key number this game heads.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because you raise the number, and I always think that's the best jumping off point, as you guys do such a great job of outlining where the number would have been, where it's potentially going, and most importantly, where it's going to close. You saw the first little bit of support come in on the dog, but it doesn't take much early in the week to take a number from 8 down to 7. Let it sit on the key before you can pile drive into this thing, and it'll be fascinating to see if it gets to 7.5, if it gets to 6.5, or maybe even sits here right at 7 should a battle ensue. It's not often, gentlemen, that we go from Power 5 conferences into the realm of the Group of 5 with a meaningful football game. This one will go a long way in determining the AAC pecking order, and arguably probably should have been where College Football Game Day made its maiden voyage to New Orleans for Central Florida to take on Tulane. You're looking at Tulane, a 2-point home favorite in this matchup, total of 55. Tulane comes in at 8-1. Their only blemish ATS was an outright loss to USM early in the year, a game they dominated. They were done in by special teams and miscues there. Central Florida, questions abound in terms of who their starting quarterback will be on Saturday. Will it be Mikey Keene picking up where he left off against Memphis, or will John Reese Plumlee return from injury? This game will be the first contest involving Tulane's football program where Tulane and its opponent are both both ranked, going all the way back to 1973, which was actually the Blue Bonnet Bowl against Houston, and the first home game where both teams are ranked since 1949 against LSU. Tulane, as I mentioned, been the best team in the country, ATS. UCF has beaten Tulane 4 straight meetings, but Tulane, to their credit, has covered 5 out of 6. Brad, when you look at these two teams, we don't do the Group of 5 conference previews, but there was a lot of buzz about this Tulane team having a chance to bounce back from what we saw last year. Willie Fritz held in some very high regard by a lot of smarter football people than me. Did you ever see Michael Pratt leading this team potentially to a conference championship, putting them in control of their own destiny as we inch closer to the finish line here?
I did not. Obviously, some big-time regret not even betting their season win total, although, you mentioned it. It was priced in that Tulane was going to be one of the most improved teams in the country. This is a team that won 2 games a year ago. Their season win total was 6. So, there was some big-time expected improvement there, and it's obviously they've even far exceeded that. With that being said, I'm wondering if we're getting to the point now where you just mentioned, hey, they're the best ATS team in the country. If now you're finally maybe starting to pay a little bit of a premium if you want to back the home team there in Tulane. We've seen some early money in the week come in on Tulane. It's probably twofold excitement for Tulane, and anybody that's been backing them recently has been winning and covering. But also I would say that I think there's something wrong in the market when it comes to grading and evaluating UCF's quarterback situation. I guess I'm opposite as far as what the market perceives Mikey Keene to be. I like Mikey Keene compared to Plumlee. Now, he's not as a dynamic of an athlete. He's not going to give you the quarterback run game that Plumlee's going to have. But one thing he's going to do, probably protect the football a little bit better. And I think he's a better passer, period. A significant better passer. Completion percentage is there. Interceptions are way lower than Plumlee. He's got plenty of experience. He's basically the starter for all of last year after Dylan Gabriel went down. And their season you would have thought would have been over with a first-year coach and a backup quarterback, and he led him to 9 wins, including a bowl win over Florida. So I kind of like Mikey Keene. I don't think he's that big of a downgrade. So I guess what I'm getting at is disagreeing with some of the market moves against UCF the last couple of weeks.
And I would echo a lot of that same sentiment. I wasn't quite sure how he was going to look when he was thrust into action against Cincinnati a couple of weeks ago. Stabilized the troops. We saw the defense rally around him. And obviously UCF goes into an underrated home field advantage for Memphis last week at the Liberty Bowl. Takes care of business. And to your point, talking about Tulane, we saw a massive move come in against the Green Wave last Saturday on Tulsa. On game day, all the 7s disappeared down to 6.5. To Tulane's credit, they dominated that game from start to finish, was never really in jeopardy in terms of their ability to cover, and a lot of that was because Tajay Spears and what he means as a physically imposing ground and pound presence. Payne, when you look at Tulane, their resurgence this season has largely been fueled by what they've done on the defensive side. First in points per game allowed in the ACC, first in yards per game, first in 20 yards plays allowed, first in third down defense. But Brad talked about Mikey Keene and what he brings to the table. Which side of the ball do you feel determines the outcome and who takes control of the race for the AAC championship Saturday?
Well, just based on the vibe I'm catching from both of you, there's a number that would be intriguing for you gentlemen if it were to get there on the road team. And what I'm going to say to you is I don't have much interest in this game right now either, but that could change if a little more work gets done in Threes Pop. And specific to the matchup, both teams have a run rate well over expectation. Both are fringe top 25 in overall run rate. And when I think about trench play on both sides, to me, it looks like UCF has the advantage. When UCF's on offense, they have a rushing attack that's top 20 in both schedule-adjusted success rate and explosiveness. Tulane's shown the ability to handle the run because its backers and safeties are damn good at the G5 level, but they've actually been pushed around in the trenches outside the top 100 in both defensive line yards and defensive line havoc created. And then you flip it around to the other side of the ball. Tulane obviously wants to get Tajay Spears the ball, and it makes sense. Guys averaging 3.7 yards per rush after first contact, but UCF's front shockingly pretty good. Stuffed more than 23% of the runs. They're top 25 in schedule-adjusted defensive line yards, havoc, and rushing success rate allowed. Tulane's O-line also allows a ton of negative plays. So to me, there's trench advantages for UCF on both sides. All signs to me, from what I've reading, what I've been hearing, John Rice Plumlee should be back under center for UCF. It was a concussion, right? But there are some whispers that both quarterbacks could play. You guys hit this perfectly in that Mikey Keene showed well last week, showed well earlier in the season, had some glimpses even last year, and I think he's the much better thrower, as Brad alluded to. And in a game this important, there's no reason to tip your hand. Make Tulane prepare for both quarterbacks, knowing how polar opposite their styles are.
Now, one thing I do have to say, because we like to play devil's advocate and make the case for both sides here, there are some concerns for the UCF side, specifically on the defensive side. Need to generate pressure, something that there was none of in their 35-28 win against Memphis. The defense had 0 sacks as a unit. And Payne, you talk about Tulane being susceptible to the negative plays. UCF didn't show the ability to do that. There are also some injury concerns for the Knights when you look at linebacker Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste and safeties Devad Wilson and Quadric Bullard. So a lot of factors in play here that you're going to want to try and incorporate into your handicapping before arriving at an ultimate investment opportunity. One last thing, Brad, a question for you, being a more in-depth football guy than the both of us. If you had to pick a head coach between Willie Fritz and Guts Malzahn, who gets the nod on the sidelines?
Yeah, Willie Fritz. I'm glad. See, you read my mind. I would say another major advantage for Tulane is at the head coaching position. Willie Fritz is a much better head coach. X's and O's and consistency, even though they had a bad year a year ago. Willie Fritz, and if you're not familiar with Willie Fritz, this isn't his first show. I mean, he's won everywhere where he's been at every single level. Division II, FCS, Georgia Southern, Tulane. I think he's one of the best Group of 5 coaches in the country.
Yeah, not always the sexiest name who gets thrown around for bigger, high-profile jobs, but you wonder if somebody will come knocking should Tulane do what a lot of folks thought was unthinkable coming into the year and win the AAC as a long shot of right around 30-1. All right, from the Group of 5, gentlemen, we head to big boy football out in the Pacific Northwest, where two familiar foes were new acquaintances. The Oregon Ducks, nearly a 2-touchdown favorite, 13.5 painted across the board, total in the low 70s at 72.5, will invite the Washington Huskies into Autzen Stadium. This is a rivalry game that has been played regularly since 1900. The two campuses a bit more than 280 miles apart, split down the I-5 corridor. It's been a matchup historically dominated by Washington, but that hasn't been the case for Johnny-come-lately college football fans, as Oregon has carried all the water in recent memory, winning 15 of the last 17 games. And Payne, I kind of joked with you last week in prepping for Florida State-Miami. It was a former member of the Ducks who highlighted how important this rivalry is, and Michael Pittman saying basically, hey, we see Washington as the biggest rival in Eugene. It's not that other school in Corvallis. I'm paraphrasing, of course. So it opened my eyes to some of this. And when you look at Oregon, this is a team that's been dominant at the betting window lately. 5-0 ATS the last 5 games, 7-1 ATS the last 8 games, 4-0 ATS at home. The average cover margin by nearly 2 touchdowns a contest. 2-0 ATS as a double-digit home favorite covered versus Eastern Washington and Stanford. And when you look at what this team does in their own building, they've been an absolute juggernaut. In comes a Washington Huskies team who surprised a lot of us early in the year for how buttoned up they were, the changes we saw instituted by Kalen DeBoer, and what Michael Penix meant to the offense. But recently, the betting market has caught up to Washington. They're 0-5 ATS the last 5 after starting with an unblemished record in their first 4. 0-3 ATS on the road. Their lone road win came at Cal, where they had to outlast the Golden Bears to the tune of 28-21. Brad, when I look at Oregon, obviously we put the loss to Georgia in the season opener to some extent in the rearview mirror. Dan Lanning has this offense humming under Kenny Dillingham's offensive coordinatorship. We've seen Bo Nix protect the football, get himself into the thick of the Heisman Trophy race. As far as Oregon and their full body of work, are you buying what you've seen so far over the last 8 games?
I am. And obviously, since that Georgia game, I've upgraded Oregon about a touchdown. And I was pretty high on Oregon to come into the season. I actually bet them over their season win total. So I was actually buying, even though it was a brand new quarterback and a first-time head coach in an entirely different new region of the country. What I was buying was the talent level that Mario Cristobal recruited the last 3-4 years. We've seen that come to fruition. I thought Lanning did a good job as far as the coordinator hires, especially on the offensive side of the ball. So, I mean, if we just exclude the Georgia game, I can make a strong case that Oregon's been a top 5 team the last 8 weeks, and certainly on the offense side of the ball, where I don't think anyone could argue that it's Ohio State, Tennessee, and Oregon as far as top 3 offenses in the country right now. And honestly, Oregon's been the most consistent of the bunch. Now, strength of schedule comes into that, and Pac-12 defenses aren't as good, but they're not going to be facing a great defense in Washington on Saturday, because the Huskies, maybe their stats look okay, but when they've had to step up in competition, Washington's defense against the 2 of the better Pac-12 offenses, UCLA and Arizona, was not a good look at all for Washington. So thumbs up. I think it's going to continue for Oregon.
And you mentioned the Oregon offense, Brad, just to kind of put things in perspective. They've now won 5 straight games by 15-plus points. It's the longest such streak in the nation, and done so in 7 of 8. The only one was the trip to Pullman, the little bit of an outlier there. They've scored 40-plus points in 8 straight games, the longest streak since 2014. They're the only FBS team to score 40-plus points 8 times already this season. They've won 27 games in a row when scoring 40-plus points. Payne, Brad talked about some of the potential frailties from Washington defensively. Where have you seen some of the areas where they may be most vulnerable to what Oregon wants to do with Bo Nix, not just as a rushing threat, not just as a passing threat, but we saw glimpses of Bo Nix, the receiver, in the resounding win against Colorado last Saturday.
Kenny D is an interesting one. Let's just put it that way. Very imaginative. The Huskies are not getting stops here. Okay, like this really
that's a short
is
handicap.
the only
we should
way.
Move on to the next game then, if that's the case.
I mean, candidly, that's what this game is. This is one of the easier handicaps of the entire card, and it seems pretty straightforward. The only way Washington's getting stops is if Bo Nix and Kenny D like simultaneously throw up on themselves. And whether it was during our preview series or leading up to the UCLA game that Brad referenced, we talked about the problems Washington has defensively. They lost premium talent in the secondary with Trent McDuffie and Gordon, and McDuffie looks like an absolute bona fide hit for Kansas City. I mean, this secondary has really been pieced together. And then you look in the front 7 for Washington, it's either guys returning from serious injury or haven't proven they can stay healthy. And so on paper, this is one of the largest mismatches of the entire week. And if you factor in home Bo Nix, the numbers are even more staggering. But will you look when Oregon attempts to run the ball here, they're number 1 in schedule adjusted rush attack. That's, both success rate and EPA per rush. Washington defensively outside the top 100 in EPA per rush allowed. When Bo Nix does drop back to pass, Washington again has not shown an ability to do much defending the pass, whether it's creating havoc or pressure up front. So you're looking at Washington, if they're not making Bo Nix uncomfortable, if he's throwing from clean pockets or he's throwing on the move without duress, I just don't see how a pieced together Husker secondary that's outside the top 100 in schedule adjusted passing success rate, explosive passes allowed, and EPA per pass allowed is suddenly just going to figure this thing out. And you just look at some of the pieces that Washington's put together back there. I mean, they had to hit the transfer portal. They haven't been overly healthy in the secondary. It's forced guys to be moved around and play in spots they really aren't comfortable with or that are their natural positions. So to me, Oregon's going to have a 5 in front of their name on the scoreboard here unless quarterback injury, weather, or they're just simply not being pushed by Washington's offense.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Washington offensively. We've seen some of the gaudy numbers they put forth, but you dig into the box scores a little bit, and I'll highlight one game in particular. The first time they were tested on a Friday night in the Rose Bowl against UCLA, they had 16 points through 3 quarters. Now, Brad, obviously Washington's numbers last Friday night get suppressed a little bit. They played in less than ideal conditions against Oregon State. They dominated the box score, but they did get 2 stops against Oregon State early on that could have swung that game very differently when the Beavers were short on downs inside that 20-yard line. Washington fails to score a touchdown. The game ends up falling 3. 3. When it comes to making adjustments this late in the year, how do you handle some of that when there are situations and circumstances beyond a team's control, and balancing what Washington is offensively with what some of they're not on the defensive side?
That's a really good question. So I might have decided to punish Washington a little bit more last week, especially what I saw in the first half. But obviously they were the team that was more impacted from the windy conditions than Oregon State. So as always, case by case basis. So especially when you get into November, what weather can, and we saw it in multiple games last week. I mean, the weather impacted teams like Purdue and Maryland along with Washington as far as the wind. What I will say though is concerning for me, and one of the reasons why I think Washington has struggled in this 5-game stretch where they haven't covered any games, not only defensive concerns, I got concerns with the offense being too reliant on Michael Penix. I mean, first 4 games of the season, I thought they had a decent balance run pass. I mean, he was only averaging 38.5 attempts per game. Last 5 weeks, 50 pass per attempts a game. And I'll say this, while his best success as a quarterback has come when Kalen DeBoer's been either his offensive coordinator or his head coach, he can at times be prone to, throwing a pick or 2 or 3. So when you rely on him, when you're over relying on him, I question the ability to have consistency there. And especially when you can't run the football. I mean, Washington's averaging less than 100 rushing yards per game the last 5 games. So pretty one-dimensional is what I've seen from Washington. And again, I'm not sure that's conducive to having a ton of success on the scoreboard. I mean, they'll move the football, they'll score, but I don't know if they're going to be balanced enough to keep the ball out of the hands out of Oregon's offense. I mean, that's what you want to do here, is keep Oregon's offense off the field.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the concerns about the ground game, and that's been evident in Washington, who looked to start the season with Wayne, Taulapapa as their lead back. We've seen Cameron Davis take on more of the workload, but it hasn't exactly been dynamic or explosive by any stretch of the imagination. 24 carries and slightly over 100 yards rushing through the last 2 games against an Oregon State team that, if your offensive line is gelling, you should be able to run the ball rather than throwing into the teeth of their secondary. Payne, you talked about Oregon and the success they're going to have offensively against Washington's defense. Oregon defensively, do they have the pieces in place to make it a very difficult Saturday, late afternoon, early evening for Michael Penix and what Washington wants to do, chucking the ball all over the yard?
Yeah, I mean, I'll double down and say the very same thing, in that this is very straightforward to me. Either the Huskies are operating at their peak throwing the football, and Penix and his talented receivers are good enough to match Oregon's offense to stay within this number, or they're going to stall out a few times and lose the possession game and can't play keep up. And you kind of gravitate towards that being the case a little bit, because Brad hit it perfectly in that the run game hasn't been overly efficient the last handful of games, and Penix does have that ability to throw an interception or 2, but this is very much about Penix finding his guys in Rome and McMillan and Polk and attacking the Ducks secondary that is extremely vulnerable. That is their weakness. Even with Dan Lanning being their defensive coordinator, the one area where there was some attrition that Mario Cristobal didn't really recruit the best, and some of those guys transferred out, was the secondary. And Oregon's outside the top 100 in schedule-adjusted passing success rate allowed, in EPA per pass allowed. And Washington's offensive line does a very nice job keeping Penix upright. Only been pressured about 20% of his dropbacks, and typically when he's sacked, they're coverage sacks. When Penix is kept clean, he's releasing it in 2.3 seconds. When he's pressured, that number exceeds 3.1 seconds. So that'll be an interesting dynamic here. If he's getting it out on time, we might not see those potential turnovers that he's been prone to. They tend to come when he's holding on to the ball a little bit too long and he's not reading the defense properly. Oregon's defense does a decent job making you at least work it through the air. Like, they're not being gashed for these 60-yard explosives, and they do make you go, just methodically through the air. So the passing success rate isn't terrible. The other thing that's interesting to me here is Oregon's defensive line does have some talent there that's now being coached up properly, and it was good if you did some reading. It looks like defensive end DJ Johnson returned to practice on Tuesday after missing the Colorado game, so that would be a good get back for the front seven for Oregon. He's shown an ability to get some pressure. And if you look at Oregon, they do a decent job on passing downs, getting some pressure there. So they're going to have to win a few of those third and mediums. Here is what is interesting to me is you guys both mentioned schedule. You guys both mentioned the potential win that Washington faced on Friday evening last week, and that is why we did see some sharp money on Oregon State. But you look at who the Huskies have played. I mean, it's a schedule of defenses that have an average rank of 79th in efficiency. And whether it's Kent State or it's Sparty or UCLA or Cal, most of those defenses that Washington's played, they're better against the run than pass. And so those numbers, I think, are even worse than what we look when you kind of view the entire profile of the defenses they've played. Washington was off the bye. Had 2 weeks to prepare. You're at home, and you get the best defense they've faced all season in Oregon State, and whether it was success rate, explosive pass rate, adjusted net yards per pass attempt, and again, I know there was some win there. Pennington, Washington was below the national average in all of those categories, and when I watched the game, based upon the early week move on the total, there was substantially less weather than was initially anticipated there. And now you have Washington facing the second toughest defense on its schedule to date. Dan Lanning got a little bit of a glimpse last week of the blueprint from Oregon State. Is that enough to get a stop or two or create a turnover or two? And again, in a game like this, field goals are a win for the defense. So this just, to me, has the makings of Oregon being able to do whatever they want offensively and getting the stop or two they need defensively. It doesn't shock me that Oregon's taking a little money here. Our number on this was like 15.1.
No atmospheric river that we saw last Friday night. The winds obviously played a role, but you're right. When you talk about Oregon and how prolific this team can be on the offensive side, a scary proposition, especially when they have the home crowd behind them. And we'll see if Bo Nix can continue his ascent as far as Heisman voters are concerned and throw his hat directly into the ring over the next couple weeks while Oregon will be tested, not just against Washington, but a date against Utah before they'll finish up their regular season against an in-state rival in Oregon State. You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. You can follow Payne on Twitter as well, at Payne Insider. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, to check out our new sports card and memorabilia podcast called Cardboard Chat. It's a great look at it. Rapidly growing industry and an outstanding investment alternative asset class for those folks that have a passion about sports. Speaking of passion about sports, we will see that in the state of Texas, a game that we kind of teased a little bit earlier in the show, where it's Texas, a full touchdown favor. The total is 65.5, as they'll welcome in undefeated TCU into Darrell Royal Stadium. And we can start with the number here, Brad. First and foremost, it's getting all sorts of buzz. I can't tell you, much like Georgia Tennessee last week, how many folks that I know that don't do this for a living, they open up the newspaper on Saturday, they look at the numbers and go, holy hell, Texas is a full touchdown favorite. I'll let you peel back the curtain a little bit and indicate why this number may not still even be an accurate reflection of where this should be priced.
Yeah, so let's start on the Texas side. Even though Texas has lost 3 games this season, I mean, obviously all 3 of them were coin flips. Could have easily won all 3, including the Alabama game, especially if Quinn Ewers doesn't go down. They controlled most of the game against Texas Tech, somehow lose in overtime. And then, again, control the game against Oklahoma State for a majority of it, and somehow, in the second half, come up short in a game where they had 14 penalties, and the home team, Oklahoma State, had 0. So treating Texas, closer to a team that probably should only have maybe 1 loss. So they're number 6 in my power rankings, even with 3 losses. TCU, despite being unbeaten, despite being significantly upgraded in my power rankings, like I mentioned at the top, not even in my top 10, number 14 in my power ratings. So it's a situation where I fully understand the number. In fact, I have Texas a little bit, a shade higher than a touchdown. Though I will say, and I'll throw this out to the both of you, specifically Todd, since he's considerably older than you and me, Payne. This is, I will say, looks better than me, though, despite his advanced age. This is, I think, a line that 15 years ago probably isn't sitting at 7. The market's pretty sharp on this one, and I'm not sure that it's coming down. I'll put it that way.
You're 100% right. And I think Payne and I have talked about this extensively, not just as it pertains to college football, but the NFL and even college basketball as well. As the markets grow more and more sophisticated, I think it removes public perception from the way that these numbers open. Whereas, on Sunday, you may have had the opportunity to lay 4 in this game before the market settled where it should be with a correct price tag at 7. But at the same time, you see how the general media gravitate towards a game. They look at a number and it blows them away a little bit. And I always say, and of course it draws the ire from new bettors to the space, that buyer beware. If it looks too good to be true in college football, it normally is. Does it always come to fruition? No, absolutely not. The public underdogs do come home to roost, but there's a reason that these numbers are as large as they are. Last week, again, I go back to it, the perfect illustration. Tennessee catching more than a touchdown. That number, when we talked on Wednesday, guys, we were hoping it got to 7. That thing was closer to 10 before it closed, and you look at who the dominant side was. Now, the one thing when you look at Texas and their full body of work, Brad, you mentioned that this team should maybe only have 1 loss. Their first halves have been as dynamic as any team in the country. I'm not sure what the hell they're doing at halftime when they rest on their laurels, because the adjustments coming out at the break aren't anything to write home about. But Payne, this is also a Texas team that's playing at home. They're 8-3 ATS at home under Sark this season. You get a TCU side that's been nothing but point spread darlings, going 7-1-1 against the number this season. They're installed as an underdog for the second time all year. When you try and isolate keys to success for Texas, is it the defense's ability to slow down Max Duggan as we wait the status update of Quentin Johnson on the outside for TCU? Or is it more about the ground and pound, getting Bijan Robinson established against this TCU defensive front, opening up some one-on-one matchups on the outside to allow Quinn Ewers to flourish? Because we've seen flashes of brilliance from Quinn, but we've also seen him struggle in stretches. Oklahoma State second half, and even last week in Manhattan when all of us were heavily invested in Texas, you saw Quinn, I don't want to say wilt under the bright lights, but not look nearly as confident throwing the ball downfield to attack a secondary that was vulnerable.
I didn't watch last week's game, just to be completely candid with you. And I know you were giving me updates.
You told me I had to do the heavy lifting for all of Bet the Board Nation. You told me I had to do the heavy lifting for us.
Now, you said something at the very top that was interesting, and I don't want to get on the soapbox here, but you said something to the effect of, if it looks too good to be true. And I think that's certainly the casual way to say it. When you are reading markets, there are certainly indicators, and this would be one of those games. And I think when we're in a time that we currently are with odds makers, there's only a handful that are originating and willing to take a stance. And because the others seem to copy, there hasn't been the need or willingness to adjust games to public perception as much as we once saw happen in this market. Specific to this game, and I think it's best to start on the TCU offensive side. They've stepped up in class one time this season. It was against Kansas State. Only time they've played a top 20 schedule adjusted defense. And you can look at the scoreboard and feel good about seeing 38 there if you're a Frogs fan. But that was because Kansas State's starting quarterback left after 1 possession. It's a third stringer who's making an appearance in crunch time. And you saw Kansas State's offense just bogged down, and it led to their defense wearing out a little bit and being put in bad positions. But in the first half, against the best defense on the schedule, TCU had a 38% success rate in the first quarter, a 32% success rate in the second quarter. The Longhorns defense is actually going to be the second best TCU has played. We have them inside the top 25 in schedule adjusted defense. And if you remove Tarleton and Kansas State, who we just mentioned, from the schedule, the 7 other defenses TCU's played have an average schedule adjusted defensive efficiency rank of 87th. Okay. And you are starting to see some things transpire with TCU. This is a team that doesn't necessarily have the depth of a team that's rated 4th in the country by some. And Max Duggan dealing with a tiny little calf issue. Quentin Johnson, who you mentioned, rolled his ankle at West Virginia, tweaked it again early against Texas Tech. The word is that he is going to feel things out and try to practice later today. Today's Wednesday, if you're listening later in the week. Gary Patterson knows Max Duggan inside and out, having coached him for many seasons. TCU now has to deal with pressure that they're not used to. They banged the drum and said, hey, we deserve to be in the top 4 after last week. Well, you got your wish. And now the target's on your back. You got what you wanted. And typically this is the time of year we've seen some Sonny Dykes teams tend to trail off a little bit. You look at the Longhorns defense. Damn good stopping the run, top 5 in schedule adjusted rushing success rate. They can be had a touch through the air, but Max Duggan hasn't proven to be like the most efficient, methodical passing quarterback where he's just going to gash you for 7, 8, 9, 10 yards and just be consistent moving his team down the field 7, 8, 9, 10 plays a drive. It's more about the explosiveness. And if Johnston isn't 100%, all of a sudden that explosiveness from your offense dwindles a little bit. Texas has also played a handful of mobile quarterbacks, held Donovan Smith to 2 predictive points added on runs. I know Spencer Sanders and Adrian Martinez fared a little bit better, both in that 6.5 predicted points added with their legs, but you just saw a mobile quarterback last week. And candidly, when I look at this, my number is Texas minus 5.5 on a neutral. And I just think when you start to factor in home field advantage, start to factor in guys a little bit beat up on offense for TCU, I think, to Brad's point, this line only heads in one direction.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the concerns about the opponents that TCU has faced from a defensive efficiency standpoint. Anybody who watched that game last week, and I probably watched, let's call it 3.5 quarters, mainly because I was kicking myself for not grabbing the 10 early on with Texas Tech against TCU. TCU looked confused, for lack of a better term, offensively for what Tech was doing in the first half, and it wasn't until Baron Morton leaves that game that TCU was able to seize a little bit of momentum. There was a call midway through the third quarter that I fundamentally think changed not just who covered that game, but potentially the outright winner when you take TCU out of a 3rd and long situation where Texas Tech still had momentum and turned it into a positive situation where they got 2 subsequent penalties as well, punched it in, and then it kind of rolled downhill from an errant face mask. So a lot of things have broken the way of TCU. Now, if we look at the other side of the ball real quickly, and Payne, I'll pivot right back to you. Texas's defense, we've seen how athletic they can be and the problems they can pose for opposing offenses. They've done that. Texas's offense, that's been the one unit that's been hit or miss. I feel like this is where Texas has an even bigger advantage against the TCU defense that, in my opinion, so far this year is operating with a lot of smoke and mirrors.
I think what you're feeling is you see the talent, you know how well respected Sark is as an offensive mind. And so you're thinking Texas offensively hasn't quite scratched the surface yet. And the one thing I think about TCU defensively is in 5 of the last 6 games, they've seen the opponents trot out a backup quarterback or a 3rd string quarterback. So to me, this is a massive step up in class against a healthy offense with Quinn Ewers and BJ Robinson. You look at TCU. Despite playing those offenses at less than full strength, they've been getting gashed with explosives, whether it's through the air or on the ground. TCU also hasn't shown an ability to hunker down when opponents reach their green zone. You can also push the Frogs defense around in the trenches, and the talent isn't quite there yet, right? I mean, this is a great story. You love it for Max Duggan, who's just been a battler through his college career, but the Frogs are way ahead of schedule here. And I think you ultimately see that on display as the games become a little bit more meaningful. They don't show they have the depth, and the competition increases a little bit. And I think when you just look at the matchup, we know Quinn Ewers in Texas wants to hunt that big play, that big explosive through the air. And he hasn't been great. There's like spots, there's like bits and spurts where you're like, okay. But I think if you start to see TCU have to overplay on Bijan Robinson to stop the ground game, you're going to be able to see Quinn Ewers hit some explosives downfield. And that's where TCU's just been really vulnerable. 119th in schedule adjusted explosive pass defense. They're giving up nearly 8 yards per pass attempt. So I would expect some explosives there through the air for Texas. Then on the ground, TCU's defense outside the top 80 in defensive line yards. They don't create havoc or negative plays. Outside the top 100 in both those metrics as well. And we know the strength of this Texas offense. It's relying on Bijan Robinson. And you look at Texas, they're kind of, on the cusp of being top 25 in both schedule adjusted rushing success rate and EPA per rush. My feeling is after this game, if Texas does what we think they're going to do, they will slip into the top 25 in both those categories. That's fine if you don't want to fade TCU here, if you're listening to this podcast. But I would caution grabbing the 7 here, thinking that it's too good to be true.
Yeah, we don't ever like to speak in hyperbole around these parts, but I'm happy to put it out there that this game is absolutely massive for Texas as a program. A loss here would most likely eliminate them from Big 12 title contention. A win here would allow them to control their own destiny. And for the way things have gone with one of their traditional rivals in Oklahoma, this would be a massive opportunity for them to find an inside track to Jerry's World and get that elusive conference championship. Final thing on this game, Brad, and I know you always sit with your power numbers handy. I respect your acumen there and more than anybody in the industry. To kind of put in perspective where Texas is ranked, how would you price them in a game, say, against a Tennessee or a Michigan, who are widely lauded as true top 4 teams?
Good question. Underdog, 4 or 5 points in both. So I do have a little bit of a gap there, and the gap is Michigan, Tennessee are kind of, right there at 4 and 5, and then there's, 4 or 5 point downgrade to Texas at 6.
Hey, I think a lot of people.
What would you have, Payne? You want to bet against me on that?
No. I want to actually ask this question because, I try to stay off of social media. It's a little bit of a cesspool there. But when I hopped on yesterday, all I saw was Oregon and Tennessee fans yelling at each other about who had the better loss to Georgia. And I was actually leaning towards Oregon because when I kind of think about this perceptually, Josh Heupel, 23 games in his program? That was Dan Lanning's very first. And when you look at the adjusted box scores, both lost by about roughly 26 points. One team traveled a short distance, the other one multiple time zones. So I kind of lent myself to thinking Oregon would possibly be more deserving, especially based upon the schedule if they were to run the table as well as Tennessee running the table. And those were the 2 teams that you were potentially picking to be the 4th team included in the college football playoff.
I hear you on that. I just think, you can give me all the adjusted efficiency numbers and all that stuff. 49-3 is a little bit different than 27-14. That's what the committee, that's what anyone's going to really think.
Yeah. Right. That's interesting. That's just go ahead. Todd.
But I think it's an important point to raise, not necessarily for how it's going to impact some of our betting decisions as early as this weekend, but what the committee is going to review. If you have an 11-1 Tennessee team that should be 11-1 because they're going to be massive favorites in the 3 remaining conference games that they have, an Oregon team who's going to pick up a couple of potential wins if they finish out 12-1, which would, let's say hypothetically, would include the win this week, which it would have to against Washington, a win against Utah, a win against Oregon State, and then most likely USC or UCLA, probably for their resume USC. I think it's going to be real interesting to try and watch because Oregon still isn't that same household brand. We know the committee is going to give USC the benefit of the doubt if they run the table. I'm curious if it's Oregon, Tennessee for that final spot in the playoff. Do they side with, hey, look, one of them is a 12-win conference champion despite their potentially worst loss to Georgia in the season opener? So it's definitely something to monitor.
I just think that's the debate, right? Like you have to consider this. That was game 1 of a new regime, not season 2 late in the year.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with you, Payne.
That would be the distinguisher.
I think Oregon, by that point, especially when you look at who they play the next possible 4 games, would have a better resume than Tennessee. And I know Tennessee's going to hang their head on the Alabama game. I don't think we're going to talk Crimson Tide. This isn't the same Alabama team as the previous 10 years.
And I think the common denominator in all of this, guys, my biggest takeaway, Georgia is that much better than everybody in the country, or at least perceptually right now, seems to be, with Ohio State maybe the next closest team to them if the Buckeyes can get their house in order from an offensive standpoint. All right, you mentioned the SEC. We'll go there for a game that looked a heck of a lot bigger on paper had it been played at the same time last weekend, but Alabama's loss to LSU has taken some of the luster off of what we're going to see in Oxford and Vaught-Hemingway Stadium on Saturday, where it's Alabama just under a 2-touchdown favorite, 12 painted across the board. Total of 64.5 as they'll take on a rested Ole Miss side. Alabama would be eliminated from SEC title contention with a loss or LSU win at Arkansas. The Tide's 2 losses have both come with the opponent scoring game-winning points with 0 seconds left on the clock. We know the overtime loss last week at LSU, and of course Tennessee's game-winning field goal as the time regulation expired. Lane Kiffin obviously effusing his praise for Alabama, saying this is still a very good football team. Just because they have 2 losses doesn't raise that many red flags. Alabama is still one of the top 3 by almost everybody who's respected in terms of their overall power ratings. Brad, when you look at Ole Miss, we had questions about them going into the LSU game, and they didn't answer any of them about a very soft strength of schedule and being a beneficiary of playing the Sisters of the Poor. Ole Miss's power number from the start of the year to where it is now, suffice to say that it's remained about steady, or that maybe even there's a potential downgrade, given that the Rebels haven't shown us a whole heck of a lot to be excited about.
It's steady for me. I actually have them up a half point. I think a lot of it has to do with the emergence of the ground game, and Judkins, the outstanding freshman running back, so that's probably a majority of it. And keep in mind, this was a team that was dealing with significant number of transfers, also having to replace both coordinators as well. So look, schedules left a lot to be desired until that, when they finally stepped up in class and played LSU. So here we are in November, and I only got maybe a couple of decent data points on telling me how good Ole Miss is or not very good. So I've actually upgraded them a half point. But still, with that being said, they're number 16 in my power ratings.
You mentioned Quinton Judkins, and you look at what he's meant to this Ole Miss offense. 3rd in the FBS in rushing yards per game behind only a pair of service academies. 9.2 runs of 10-plus yards per game. No other FBS team has 8 this year. And when you look at the Rebels, they're averaging, more than 5.5 yards per carry. Judkins has been that star, the number 11 running back in the country and number 2 in the SEC with over 1,000 rushing yards, 13 touchdowns, and 180 carries. Zach Evans, the perfect complement in the backfield. But Payne, we've seen if you're a one-trick pony, not exactly the best recipe for going up against an Alabama defensive front that's underwhelmed. But when you're looking at this game in terms of trying to identify the matchup that you're going to be most fascinated to watch, is it the Ole Miss run-heavy attack against the Alabama defensive front, or is it trying to figure out if Alabama's oftentimes pop gun offense can have success picking up chunk yardage against an Ole Miss defense that I think can be largely overrated? The one thing that I will say, guys, I had a discussion with a college football handicapper I respect quite a bit, asked me a question. I really had to think about it, so I'm almost going to throw it back on you guys. Alabama seems hell-bent on this RPO offense with Bryce Young. I'm not sure Bryce's shoulder is 100%. Does Ole Miss even have to respect Bryce Young's willingness to pull the ball and run? We didn't see a ton of it last week against LSU. He was relegated to a little bit more of a pocket passer.
Well, I'll say this quickly, and I'll let Professor Payne go 300 level. I'm not sure Ole Miss has a guy capable of, a Harold Perkins type that can spy Bryce Young. So we'll see. But I agree, Bryce Young didn't look himself last week, and then some. I don't care how much he got pressured. That from start to finish, he did not look like the Bryce Young. What's shocking is didn't even look as good as what he did, obviously, in the Tennessee game when he was immediately coming off that injury.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if it's a cumulative impact of getting hit over and over on that shoulder. But we digress, Payne. Want to get your thoughts in terms of what matchup you think will be most important in defining who gets to the window with the number sitting Alabama minus 12.
I think your question's interesting, and if Bryce Young is potentially that number 1 pick once you see Alabama with a first loss and now a second loss, is he going to be a willing runner? And the one thing, though, that I think people have an issue with, like RPO offense means run pass option, right? The run part is simply handing it off to the running back or throwing it. Zone read is more of is the quarterback going to take off or not? For sure. And that really hasn't been the Bryce Young Alabama offense. I think we're all cognizant that Alabama is down this season and they have holes that we haven't seen in recent years, and some of their premium players aren't playing to the level they did a season ago. Will Anderson and Jordan Battle, those 2 dudes are going to make a lot of money on Sundays, and they're having good years relative to college football standards, but not compared to how they performed last season. They covered up just a shit ton of holes on that side of the ball last year. You think about PFF and other places and how they grade players. 60 is about an average player, and the scale's out of 100. Battle's playing to a 78 this season compared to an 88 last year. Gave up, the game-winning touchdown and then the game-winning 2-point conversion. He's not playing to what we saw last year. Will Anderson playing to an 81 this season. Last year it was a 90. And I think, the concerning part about Alabama's performance last week is they came off the bye.
Yep.
And they've done a good job, covering some numbers at home, but when they've stepped up on the road the past 2 seasons, haven't been very good, especially when they're a double-digit favorite. And I think there's lots of talk internally about guys being fired, and Ole Miss is coming off their bye week, and you have some key cogs like Jackson Dart and Zach Evans who can improve their health situations, and we've seen Lane Kiffin show some ability, at least in small doses, to give Saban some trouble. But I'm not running to back Ole Miss here. And I just think I'm a little bit lower on Ole Miss than Brad, and I've kind of intimated that the few times we've talked about them. The areas where Alabama's been most vulnerable aren't the areas where Ole Miss has been great. I mean, Alabama's offensive line, we talked about some issues there that they've had this season where, they're not creating a ton of push in the run game, and they've had too many mental mistakes in pass protection and with pre-snap penalties. But defensively, Ole Miss has been bullied in the trenches on the ground. The Rebels are outside the top 90 in schedule-adjusted defensive line yards, rushing success rate allowed, and EPA per rush allowed. So Bama, I think, finds a little bit more success on the ground here. And if Bama's balanced, it should allow Bryce Young to be better protected and throw receivers open a little bit better, which is what that receiver group needs right now. Ole Miss outside the top 90 in both passing down sack rate and EPA per pass allowed. So there's going to be some opportunities, I think, for Bama's offense, unless they've just, with 2 losses, throw in the towel a little bit here. Defensively for Bama, they're not going against the Rebels O-line that's getting a ton of push here. Ole Miss outside the top 95 in schedule-adjusted offensive line yards created and tackles allowed for loss. So you can create some havoc against those guys. Bama still playing to a top 20 level in defensive line havoc created. So there's some spots here that I just don't love matchup-wise, to where I'm just like, hey, I'm going to go run and bet Ole Miss here because I think Bama's down, and all of the forward-facing media just crapping on Nick Saban all week, and Alabama might just be what wakes up a 2-loss team a little bit here. And listen, I'm a Lane Kiffin guy. You can probably figure out why based upon proximity from some of his stops. And I just haven't bought Ole Miss at a single point this season. I think they're wildly overrated. The schedule has been cotton soft. The best team on their schedule was LSU. The Rebels lost by nearly 4 touchdowns after leading by 2 scores early. Even the A&M game before the bye, Rebels couldn't beat the closing number after rushing for nearly 400 yards. I'm just not sure what they are, and I'm just not ready to dance on Nick Saban's grave quite yet.
Well, either was Lane Kiffin, because he obviously downplayed that pretty quickly and wanted to temper some of the expectations. So I think Lane Train knows what he's up against, even with the game taking place at Ole Miss and a wounded Alabama team who arguably is just going to play out the string over the next couple weeks. Going to need a whole lot of help if they're going to find an opportunity or an avenue to get into the college football playoff discussion. And I think
Here's something that's interesting, by the way, and let's chat about this. All of the rumors have been that Auburn's going to make a play for Lane. I have been hearing that when Nick eventually does retire, he thinks the world of Lane Kiffin, and he thinks the off-field stuff has been fixed, and that he would be the guy to take over at Alabama, and that might be the reason he wouldn't take the Auburn job. Have you guys heard anything to that nature?
Brad, I'll let you go first, and then I'm happy to jump in.
That is what I have heard as well. And if there's anyone that would follow Nick Saban, Lane has the type of personality and mindset that he would take a job like that. So I don't know why you take the Auburn job. I don't know how much better that job is than Ole Miss. Certainly Auburn's won a national title here in recent history, that they've been to a national championship game, but I just, right now, the expectation is probably too high than what reality is for that program. So I'm not leaving Ole Miss for Auburn. I would leave Ole Miss for Alabama.
Supposedly the pitch point is that Auburn has a $11 million NIL fund just waiting for the next coach in line, and that Lane has intimated not being overly happy with the NIL stuff going on at Ole Miss currently. That's initially how those rumors started swirling.
I just wonder the whole Auburn program in general, and Brad, kind of piggybacking your point there, how easy it is to win there. I think it's a lot more complex job than people want to give it credit for. I know, Payne, you mentioned the NIL money, and there is a lot of support from the alumni base, but it's a lot more meddlesome boosters than you'll see in a lot of programs. And I think to some extent, Auburn has a lot of the similarities to the problems that have plagued Texas over the last couple of years, where you can be the best X's and O's guy. You can run an airtight program and be an elite level recruiter, but unless you can be a consummate politician like a Mac Brown was in Austin, it's a very difficult place to keep two disparate factions together, because you have a strong religious contingent that wants some of those values imbued in their program at Auburn, and then you have that win at all costs contingent that doesn't care what these coaches do off the field as long as the results translate. So I almost feel it takes a special personality to be able to balance both of those groups of individuals that have so much say and such deep pockets to make Auburn relevant both on the football field and off.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see ultimately how this plays out. And I don't know if Lane Kiffin's the kind of guy that is going to be willing to be dictated to by a bunch of boosters. So that'll ultimately be interesting. But the reason I asked that is the understanding would be if that lane went to Kiffin, Alabama might not accept him once Saban were to step down. That's basically what I've
definitely
heard.
add a unique wrinkle to the Iron Bowl, that's for sure. If Alabama picked up Auburn's head coach a year or two down the road, should Nick Saban decide to hang it up. But clearly, silly season is officially upon us as far as the college football world is concerned. We'll see how that coaching carousel plays out. I know a lot of our listeners, guys, are probably thinking, well, you guys have broken down all the biggest games on the board. That's it. We're not going to get anything else from you today. This is where we come in over the top and land that haymaker, Brad, because we haven't talked about the non-Powers 5 game yet, and you have found an absolute gem for us in the college football hotbed of Colorado Springs, where it's the Air Force Falcons, 3 touchdown plus favorites against the New Mexico Lobos. Total on this game, a robust 37.5, and there's nothing that says get your juices flowing on a college football Saturday than the Lobos and Falcons, two teams that want to do nothing but run the football for 60 minutes.
Yeah, so very intriguing handicap to say the least. I mean, obviously got a big favorite, an extremely low total, mainly due to the fact that New Mexico couldn't make a case, has the worst offense in college football. With that being said, I think there's a pathway, at least here for New Mexico, to keep it a little bit closer than the current number. And it's taking money all week. It's down to 21.5 as we're taping this on Wednesday. I've watched probably too much New Mexico football this year, but I would find it very hard to find a more hard luck team than New Mexico this year. I mean, it's unbelievable the bad luck they've had in the final minutes of games. 21-yard pick six with about 30 seconds left against UNLV turns a 4-point loss into an 11-point loss, a game that they led by 17 points. I was there in person. They had a 38-yard pick six with a minute left against Wyoming. That one ends up being, would have been a close loss. And then it turns into a 13-point loss, a game that they also led at halftime. Even last week, I was involved with New Mexico at Utah State. A long fumble return touchdown with 3 minutes left does them in. A game that they also led outright at halftime as a significant underdog. What I'm getting at here is not only do I think there's a little bit of value because of all those kind of misleading finals on New Mexico full game, but I'm also thinking that we have an Air Force team. And usually I don't talk about, motivational highs and lows for service academies. But Air Force did win the Commander-in-Chief trophy just last week. They haven't won it in a while, 6 years. I mean, when I was growing up, they won it every year. They haven't won it in 6 years, but they did last week. And it's also an Air Force team that I love this year. I mean, I bet more on their season win total than any team in the country, and they've struggled. They've been favored in every single game, one of the reasons why I bet over. And they have a losing record against the spread. They've lost 3 games outright, including 2 as a big favorite outright. So this is not necessarily a team I want to lay a lot of points with. So I'm getting at New Mexico full game, 21.5 or more, first half, plus 11.5 or more.
Rocky Long against the option, tried and true, trying to figure out unique wrinkles to slow that down. And when you mention Air Force, I've been amazed, Brad, honestly, watching this team, to your point, talking about them underwhelming from a Vegas expectation standpoint, but the sheer workload that they've put on Brad Roberts in that backfield. I mean, normally we see these service academies divvy up the carries a little bit, but Roberts has far and away been the bell cow. 157 carries over the last 6 games as he's touched the ball 20 plus time. Zeke Daniels has really struggled to give them a semblance of a passing game. So I can understand completely where you're coming from, knowing that Air Force really hasn't run away and hidden from any of their opponents. Payne, I know this might oftentimes be above your pay grade, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to add anything to the Air Force New Mexico showdown, a game that no doubt in my mind is bound to get big screen treatment in the Payne Man Cave.
Well, I want to say a couple things here. I commend Brad for knowing that this is a safe space and admitting to watching New Mexico football and attending games live. And I feel good that he's comfortable enough to do that with us here in his presence. Brad, I think, hit this perfectly, right? I mean, the total's trending towards 37.5. You can get 22.5 out west. You have 2 of the slowest teams in the country. And I think you guys mentioned it, but the defensive coordinator for New Mexico has stifled this type of offense numerous times over the years. So I think this is a really interesting one. I'd seen it come into some accounts. I hadn't really fully assessed it yet, but as soon as we get off this podcast, I'm definitely going to dig back in and see if I can confirm a few things. And if so, I will be joining Brad on New Mexico here.
Hey, there's nothing that says getting paid at the window than betting on New Mexico, hoping they can just run the clock. And worst case scenario, if it gets down inside the final 5 minutes in the fourth quarter with a full game bet, rather than watching a Lobos drop back to pass, hope they just take knees and do the right thing to try and get people to the window rather than putting the ball in harm's way. You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me on social media. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod for all things Bet the Board. Brad, we've covered a ton of ground like we always do on Wednesdays. I wasn't sure if there were any nuggets, tidbits, other things you'd like to get off your chest before we reconvene 7 days from now.
I do not. Usually I have a snarky comment. I don't. It was a pleasure, guys, as always.
Hey, best of luck this weekend, my friend. I know you'll have close to 100 investments that you'll be sweating throughout the course of a college football Saturday, and wish you nothing but the best. I'll look forward to chatting with you same time, same place next week.
Thanks, guys.
Always good to get Brad's take on some of the games. And Payne, I do applaud you for saying this is a safe space, but I wonder about the mental welfare for Brad, openly admitting that he does watch New Mexico games in their entirety, that he's seen them live. But I have to come clean as well, because for the first time all season, come Friday night, I'm poised to set foot in Allegiant Stadium and actually watch UNLV in person, but I'm at least going because I want to see Jake Haener. I'm not sure I would have gone on a Friday night to watch Los Lobos.
Another Friday evening of Todd Furman out and about, just gallivanting among the streets of Las Vegas. I love it.
Here we go. There may be one adult beverage max. I will be up crack of dawn on Saturday, like always, ready to fully immerse myself in a college football board that will light up like a Christmas tree. And seeing one of the games that we broke down just a few moments ago, starting to take a little bit of money as well. For folks who want to scramble through their odds screen, figure out exactly what time we record this. It can be looking for a needle in a haystack. But all right, we do have one final order of business to get resolved before we bid our listeners a fond farewell for yet another busy college football week. And it's identifying where in the college football landscape we're going for a best bet opportunity.
So it was a game that we broke down at the top of the show, North Carolina, Wake Forest. So I'm not going to repeat myself. I would go back and listen. It's obviously time-stamped, but just in general, I think there is some value here on Wake Forest. So rotation number 126, Wake Forest. Let's lay it. This is difficult, right? Because I would never suggest buying to 3 with a total at 77. There are some places, specifically Pinnacle, that's dealing 3.5 even right now on Wake Forest. I'll probably attack that and make the cheap purchase there on 3. And the one difficult part, and just to kind of shed some light and peel back the curtain. When we record these on Wednesday, it's basically no man's land in terms of the market, right? Like if we're recording Sunday night or Monday, you're able to value grab some numbers that are just off completely. Then the market settles in a little bit. And then all of a sudden, Thursday evening, Friday, even game day, when we talk to some of the sharper bettors and groups and, i.e. compare notes, right? We understand what some of the larger positions are. So these games that we're giving, right, just kind of no man's land. And ultimately where I'm going with this is the public sentiment may drive this down to 3 naturally at kick if the groups that I speak with aren't looking to play Wake. Now, if they are, 3.5, even with the Pokemon, might be the best you get. So we'll grade it at Wake Forest minus 3.5, but I would, do your best efforts here, especially if you have access to Pinnacle and some of those skins, to lay 3. Again, kind of going back to the game, and again, my thoughts were well documented. I think there's some areas here where Wake Forest defensively are a little bit better stopping and bending in the green zone. And I think you're just buying low on Wake Forest here. Again, my number 2 weeks ago on this was 8.5. And you get a team who's lost back-to-back games because they've turned it over 11 times, and many of those were not expected turnovers. So I just don't really love what North Carolina has done to this point, despite being 8-1. It's very much a 1.5-man show with a quarterback and a wide receiver, but North Carolina just has not played a very good schedule. And the one team that they played that had a pulse, beat them by 3-4 scores in their own building.
In Sam Hartman, we trust. This is an annual tradition that when Wake Forest plays North Carolina, we're obligated to bet the game one way or another. Last year, we found ourselves on North Carolina. This year, we flipped the script and we back the Demon Deacons. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Payne, anything else you'd like to share with our loyal listeners before it's a 24-hour break and we get to do it all again in the National Football League?
That is everything, sir.
All right. On that note, I want to wish all of you, our loyal listeners, the best of luck with all of your college football week 11 investments. Thanks as always for tuning in, rating, reviewing, subscribing to the Bet the Board podcast. We'll be right back here with you next week with a little bit more clarity on the 4 teams that have an inside track to the college football playoff. And hopefully with a Wake Forest ticket in hand come Saturday evening, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.